For centuries, the peoples who inhabited the southern jungles resisted the passage of time without depending on iron, the wheel, or beasts of burden. Surrounded by mountains, rivers, and cenotes, they built more than just cities. They formed a network of lineages, alliances, and cycles that marked every step of their history. From the temples of the Payton to the central valleys, the balance was maintained amidst wars, droughts, migrations, and forgotten pacts. Among the names that crossed generations, there were cities that stood out for their resilience, their architecture, and their calendars. While some fell, others wove alliances, boosted harvests, and prolonged an order that seemed destined to disappear. Nothing that happened was an accident. What began as a local struggle ended up revealing a structure more complex and persistent than anyone expected. Because if anything defined the Maya, it was not their disappearance, but everything that came afterward. How did the empire that refused to disappear emerge and resist? The seed of the empire, geography and survival in the ancient Maya world. The region that saw the birth of the Maya civilization occupies a broad space in the southeast of Mesoamerica. This zone covers the north of Guatemala, all of Belize, parts of southern Mexico, including the states of Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatán, and Quintana Roo, as well as sections of Honduras and El Salvador. The terrain shows variety in both altitude and physical characteristics, which contributed to the unequal development of the peoples who settled there. The Maya prospered in an environment where the tropical climate, seasonal rains, and thick vegetation were constant elements of the landscape. The environmental conditions imposed limits on agricultural expansion, which motivated a very structured organization of labor and precise planning of crops. The diversity of the terrain forced communities to adapt to very different spaces, from high lands with plateaus and fertile valleys to coastal plains with poorer soils but with access to natural water networks. The river routes served as channels of communication and exchange, helping to integrate distant territories and promoting a shared culture despite the distances. The Maya region is divided by its natural features into three main areas. The first comprises the southern highlands, with mountain ranges, intermediate valleys, and volcanoes. These lands are in Guatemala, western Honduras, and the eastern part of Chiapas. Here the soils are more fertile due to their volcanic origin. The second region corresponds to the southern lowlands, which include the Petén jungle, Belize, and sectors of Tabasco and Campeche. This area is covered by dense vegetation, abundant rivers, and a very humid climate. The third zone encompasses the northern lowlands, that is the Yucatán Peninsula. The latter has a lower altitude, a drier terrain, and lacks surface rivers, although it has underground formations called cenotes, which were vital for subsistence. The Maya civilization originated in these three regions, adapting to the unique conditions unique to each one. In the southern highlands, the presence of volcanic stones facilitated the carving of tools and the construction of structures. In the southern lowlands, the abundance of water favored continuous agriculture and allowed for the growth of extensive settlements. In Yucatán, the scarcity of visible water sources led to the intensive use of the cenotes and the development of rainwater harvesting systems. Each zone offered distinct advantages and difficulties which directly influenced the type of societies that were formed. Despite the regional differences, the Maya peoples developed similar cultural patterns, partly due to their shared roots. Agriculture was the economic base from the earliest stages. Maize, along with beans, squash, and chili, formed the core of the diet. These crops demanded an organization of labor that over time generated social hierarchies and forms of authority. To maintain productivity in less fertile soils, techniques such as the slash-and-burn system were applied. This consisted of felling an area of the jungle, burning the vegetation, and planting on the earth enriched by the ashes. The need to organize agricultural cycles according to the rains led to the development of astronomical observations and time measurements. However, these advances are not explained here, as they belong to another moment. In this primitive stage, the important thing was to ensure food through rudimentary but effective techniques adapted to a challenging environment. Knowledge of the land, the climate, and natural rhythms was transmitted from generation to generation, forming part of the collective knowledge. Regarding the origin of the Maya, it is known that they were not an isolated civilization. Since remote times, the region had received influence from other Mesoamerican peoples. Interaction with neighboring groups, such as the Olmecs, allowed for the exchange of products, ideas, and cultural practices. However, the Maya developed their own distinctive features that clearly differentiate them from other cultures. Through time, they achieved a particular identity, although with multiple local variants. Internal migrations played an important role in the expansion of the early Maya. Some groups moved from mountainous zones to lower areas, seeking land suitable for cultivation. Others settled near permanent water sources where they could establish more stable communities. This process of territorial occupation was gradual but constant. The population grew as agricultural conditions improved, and that allowed for the emergence of more complex populated centers. The first material vestiges of Maya culture appear in pre-classic sites, such as Quello in Belize and Tikal in the Petén. These evidences show villages with simple structures, stone tools, and basic ceramics. Although cities or large ceremonial centers did not yet exist, signs of specialization in activities and certain social differentiation were already observed. The production of domestic objects and local commerce point to an organized economic system from early times. The evolution toward more complex forms of organization was the result of many centuries of adaptation and accumulation of knowledge. The conditions of the environment demanded creative responses, which in some cases led to technical innovations. Agricultural knowledge, for example, was refined to achieve more stable harvests in difficult terrain. In turn, the relationships between communities gave way to alliances and cooperation systems, which would later transform into more formal political structures. During these initial centuries, development was not uniform. Some regions advanced more quickly than others, depending on the available resources, their geographical location, and the capacity of their inhabitants to take advantage of them and adapt to the changing conditions of the environment. The Golden Age of the Southern Cities. When the Maya culture reached its maximum expression, the classic period had already begun its course. At that moment, the civilization experienced sustained growth in multiple regions. Populations not only multiplied, but also became denser and more active, while their cultural achievements increased. The manifestations of this advance became visible in all the important Maya centers of the south, where zones of intense activity emerged. In them, a clear coordination in the patterns of life and production was evident. As these population concentrations consolidated, the Maya area of influence also extended. In the north of Guatemala, the Petén concentrated notable activity that drove the expansion of the Maya world. Major centers were located within its boundaries, all connected by a complex system of relationships. From this nucleus, growth spread toward other parts of the south and reached zones of the lowlands. The impulse encompassed everything from the mountainous valleys of Guatemala to certain portions of current-day Chiapas. The intensity of the development translated into the simultaneous appearance of different nuclei, each with clear signs of prosperity. Throughout the centuries, activity remained constant, and in many regions it increased. The characteristics of this moment can be observed in the material testimonies left by the communities. The presence of inscriptions, stelae, altars, constructions, and decorative elements demonstrate that a complex social organization existed. Furthermore, common patterns in different cities reveal a shared evolution. The Maya centers, although politically autonomous, showed an evident cultural connection. This coincidence in styles and forms of expression indicates that constant communication existed between the various enclaves. The flourishing of the classic period was not only visible in material expressions, it was also reflected in the way the Maya groups organized their territories. From a determined point, it is observed that many cities began to acquire greater power. That authority translated into dominion over other communities, thus generating a network of regional control. The establishment of hierarchical relationships between important nuclei and smaller localities allowed for a greater degree of territorial cohesion. Although the exact limits of these jurisdictions are not always clear, evidence suggests that some cities became true regional capitals. One of the most notable features of the period was the marked expansion into new areas. Testimonies found in the Usumacinta region indicate that the cities located along that river acquired great relevance. At the same time, other zones, such as the Motagua Valley in the eastern part of the territory, began to show strong activity. These regions, previously peripheral, became fully integrated into the classic cultural sphere. The speed with which this process occurred suggests that an effective transmission structure existed. The mobility of groups, ideas, and resources facilitated the incorporation of new territories into the existing network. Throughout this period, art reached levels never before seen. The visual forms acquired remarkable technical complexity, and the represented themes became more varied. In many sites, it is observed that human figures began to show greater detail. The portrayed scenes ceased to be simple representations to become complete narratives. The carved surfaces exhibit a clear evolution in the way elements are composed. This sophistication indicates that an established tradition existed, with local schools capable of maintaining their own style. Although each center had particular features, the whole shared similar principles. The dates inscribed on monuments and objects allow for a precise chronology of the boom. In almost all regions, records accumulate between the ***3 and ***9 centuries. This period is considered the highest point of classic development. In those centuries, material production, political activity, and cultural diffusion reached their peak. The large centers rivaled each other in importance, and their influence projected beyond their immediate boundaries. The concentration of testimonies indicates that a symbolic competition existed between cities. Each one sought to leave a record of its achievements, thus establishing a permanent memory. The elements found in royal burials allow for an understanding of the magnitude of the power achieved. The tombs contained objects of high value and a careful arrangement. The offerings, both in their quantity and their elaboration, reflect a high degree of specialization. The distribution of these burials in the major centers reinforces the idea of a dominant elite. These upper layers controlled resources and organized productive labor. The presence of figures represented in elaborate attire confirms the existence of a class that concentrated authority. Despite the splendor achieved toward the end of the period, signs of transformation are perceived. In some regions, inscriptions cease abruptly. In others, the frequency of records notably decreases. The construction of new buildings diminishes and certain spaces are progressively abandoned. These evidences suggest that some centers began to experience a decrease in their dynamism. It is not yet a general collapse, but a change in the conditions that had sustained the boom. The exact reasons for this process are not exposed in the documents, but the available documentation indicates an alteration in the previous equilibrium. The appearance of internal conflicts is also hinted at in certain sites. Representations of confrontations become more common, and some monuments allude to victories over neighboring cities. This situation could have generated tensions between the ruling groups. The need to control broader territories would have required additional resources. At the same time, the growing demands of the elites could have overloaded the system. The decrease in monumental works and the simplification of styles are another indication of internal reorganization. Instead of large projects, some cities opted for more modest structures. The closing of this period was not uniform. Some regions maintained their vitality for a longer time, while others decreased their activity more early. This unequal pattern suggests that the process was complex and multifaceted. Despite this, the mark left by the classic period endured over time. The forms established during this stage continued to influence subsequent expressions. Although certain zones fell silent, others inherited and adapted the achievements of the past. What was achieved during those centuries laid a foundation that allowed for cultural continuity amidst the changes that were approaching. From the sea, the Spanish invasion and the last Maya bastion. When the Spanish first arrived in the area inhabited by the Maya peoples, they encountered a territory of difficult access, composed of extensive jungles, scarce road infrastructure, and lordships in constant rivalry. Those lands did not offer the gold and silver that motivated other campaigns, which delayed the start of a sustained military effort for years. However, the attempts began on the Yucatán Peninsula. From the beginning of the **16th century, various expeditions arrived from Cuba and other Caribbean islands, exploring the eastern coasts. The incursion led by Hernández de Córdoba in *1518* marked the first documented contact. His group toured various coastal towns and was attacked on more than one occasion. The losses forced their retreat, but the information obtained encouraged new incursions. Shortly after, Juan de Grijalva organized another expedition that advanced a little further, also with mixed results. Finally, Hernán Cortés used what he had learned from the previous ones and disembarked in the same zone, although with broader objectives that included lands outside the Maya sphere. Despite not having consolidated an immediate presence in the region, these first contacts allowed them to identify routes, evaluate forces, and detect internal divisions among the indigenous groups. In subsequent years, the Spanish concentrated their efforts on other parts of Mesoamerica, particularly in the center, where the Mexican Empire offered greater riches and a centralized organization that facilitated its conquest through alliances and open warfare. It wasn't until the middle of the century that interest in Yucatán resurfaced with greater firmness. Francisco de Montejo received authorization to undertake the task of subduing the territory. In *** 1527 **, he arrived at its coasts and began a series of military campaigns characterized by their difficulty. His first attempt to establish himself failed due to strong local resistance, which forced him to temporarily withdraw. Without giving up, he organized new entries through different points, delegating part of the command to his son, known as the Mozo, the lad, who adopted more prolonged tactics and relied on the founding of villas to consolidate positions. For years, the confrontations were constant. The Maya defended their territories through ambushes, changes of settlement, and by taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain. The Spanish, for their part, implemented strategies based on the founding of cities, assignment of encomiendas, and pacts with certain local lineages that saw in the newcomers an opportunity to prevail over traditional rivals. This combination of direct combat, alliances, and progressive attrition allowed the Castilian positions to gradually consolidate. Among the most representative episodes is the founding of Mérida, established by Montejo the Mozo on the site of an ancient Maya city. From there, the Spanish coordinated operations toward the south and the east, facing pockets of resistance that persisted even after the fall of the main centers. The climatic conditions, diseases, and hostile terrain made every advance slow and costly. Meanwhile, other zones to the south of the Maya world, particularly the Piton, maintained almost total autonomy. The dense jungles, the distances, and the lack of immediate economic interest postponed any serious effort to subdue that region. It wasn't until the end of the ** 16th ** century when the colonial authorities began to evaluate the control of the Payton Itza with greater interest, where autonomous lordships such as that of Tayasal still existed. The Itza rulers maintained relationships with other Maya peoples and occasionally with colonists who approached to trade. Despite certain contacts, there was no real subordination to Spanish power. This continued until, in the ** 17th ** century, the authorities of Guatemala and Yucatan decided to undertake a coordinated campaign. Previous failures, such as the attempt by Martin de Ursúa, had evidenced the complexity of operating in that area, but also encouraged more extensive preparations. Finally, in ** 1701 ** an expedition managed to advance decisively toward Tayasal. Despite the logistical obstacles, the Spanish commanders knew how to take advantage of internal divisions among the local groups, in addition to promises of amnesty and persuasion tactics to facilitate the surrender of some towns. The capture of Tayasal meant the formal close of the military conquest of the Maya lands. From that moment, the territories were subject to colonial institutions, although in many rural sectors, resistance was maintained passively or through migrations to more remote areas. Throughout this entire process, episodes of destruction of codices, temples, and other cultural elements were documented as part of a policy of religious conversion and ideological control. Although certain religious figures tried to preserve aspects of the local language and knowledge, many original expressions were suppressed or substituted by practices imposed by ecclesiastical doctrines. Ethnic structure at the end of the first millennium. Throughout the regions comprising the southeast of Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and sectors of Honduras and El Salvador, the groups that formed the Maya civilization settled. Each one occupied distinct zones, adapting to the local conditions and developing its own peculiarities. At the time of maximum splendor, at least ***16*** main groups were identified, distributed in 3 large linguistic areas. The northern region included the Yucatec Maya speakers, whose territory covered almost the entire Yucatan Peninsula, including Campeche, Yucatan, the north of Quintana Roo, and parts of Belize. In the south of the Peyton, the Choles occupied a strip from the middle course of the Usumacinta River eastward, while further north were the Chontals, established in the Candelaria River basin. The southwestern area, corresponding to the highlands of Guatemala and parts of southern Chiapas, was occupied by peoples who spoke Quichua, Mam, Cachical, Tzutujil, and other related dialects. This mountainous zone comprised a dense concentration of communities whose languages derived from a common trunk, although already notably differentiated. In the southeast, the groups who spoke Cholti and Mopan were found in zones of the eastern Petén and Belize, while toward the east and south extended the speakers of Pocomchi, Quechi, Chuj, Tojolabal and Lacandon, with nuclei in more remote and forested regions. The differences between these peoples were not only based on geographical location, but also on physical features which varied between regions. Different average heights were recorded between the inhabitants of the highlands and those of the lowlands. Among the former, more angular features, high cheekbones and a more robust build predominated, while in the lowlands, slender bodies were more common, with slightly smaller heights and less pronounced facial features. Pigmentation also showed certain variations, although within a uniform range. These characteristics allowed for the distinction of the different Maya subgroups, even when they shared the same mother tongue or maintained close cultural ties. Regarding language, linguistic studies allowed for the classification of the Maya languages into well-defined branches. All of them derived from a Proto-Maya language, whose existence dated back several centuries before the Classic period. From this common root emerged various linguistic families, which evolved independently as populations became isolated or migrated to new regions. One of the main divisions was established between the dialects of the Western group, which included Chol, Chontal, Chuj, and Tojolabal, and those of the Eastern group, where Quiche, Pocomchi, Quechi, and Mopan were found. Yucatec, although related to the other Maya languages, was considered a separate branch. Its geographical isolation in the north of the peninsula and the independent evolution it experienced contributed to it developing its own characteristics in phonetics, grammar, and vocabulary. In turn, within Yucatec, there were minor dialectal variations, the product of regional differences between populations in Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo. These variations did not impede mutual understanding among speakers, but they did reflect processes of internal differentiation over time. The number of speakers of each language varied widely. It was estimated that Quiche, the most spoken language of the highlands, had more than **** 500,000 people. It was followed by Mam and Quechi, with several **** hundreds of thousands ****. Tzutujil, Pocomam, and Chuj recorded smaller though significant figures. In the lowlands, Yucatec grouped a large proportion of speakers, especially in the centuries prior to the conquest. Cholti, used mainly in the central area of the Peyton, and Mopan, spoken in the Belize region, were less numerous, but played a relevant role in the transmission of religious traditions and hieroglyphic records. The degree of linguistic evolution achieved by the Maya allowed for the expression of abstract concepts, complex structures, and notions of time and space with a high level of precision. Maya languages had sophisticated verbal systems that allowed for marking nuances of action, aspect, and mood. Verbal inflection was one of the most developed features, and nominal forms included mechanisms to indicate number, possession, and syntactic relationships. Even though the Maya peoples shared certain linguistic bases, the divergence between their languages made direct communication difficult between distant groups. In many cases, it was necessary to resort to interpreters or mediators, especially when dealing with contacts between peoples from different regions. Commercial contacts, political alliances, or military conflicts generated situations where mutual understanding was essential, which fostered the emergence of ***linguae francae***, or the extended use of certain better-known dialects. In some periods, certain languages acquired a position of prestige or cultural dominance, which converted them into tools for administration and communication between peoples speaking different languages. Cholti, for example, was adopted as the language of ritual and administrative use by certain groups in the Payton during the final phase of the Classic period. This phenomenon did not imply the disappearance of the other dialects, but rather a linguistic hierarchy based on social and political factors. Modern studies on the classification of these languages were based on phonological analyses, comparisons of basic vocabulary, grammatical structures, and oral traditions. Thanks to these criteria, it was possible to partially reconstruct the evolution of Proto-Maya, identify the main moments of divergence, and establish linguistic maps that more precisely reflected the historical distribution of the languages. This reconstruction also allowed for tracing relationships between human groups, understanding their displacements, and detecting the zones of greatest cultural permanence. The fact that many Maya languages have been preserved until today offered a solid base for research and comparison with ancient texts, despite the fragmentation caused by the conquest and colonization. The persistence of the Maya languages throughout the centuries was possible thanks to oral transmission within communities, everyday use in family contexts, and resistance against the imposition of external languages. In many regions, Maya languages continued to be the main means of communication, even when traditional political and religious structures disappeared. This linguistic continuity not only demonstrated the vitality of the languages, but also the importance they held for the collective identity of the peoples who spoke them. Despite external pressures, many groups maintained their ways of speaking and their associated cultural patterns, preserving a millennial heritage that remained alive in the modern era. Early colonial documentation offered valuable data on the linguistic situation of the post-conquest era, including vocabularies, grammars, and texts translated by missionaries. Although these sources were influenced by evangelizing interests, they provided a relatively precise vision of the state of the Maya languages in the **16th** century. Thanks to them, it was possible to identify the changes that had occurred since the Classic period, compare the recorded forms with the current ones, and observe the evolution of certain terms, expressions, or grammatical constructions. The Maya language, in all its variants, constituted a key element for understanding history, the relationships between peoples, and the continuity of traditions. Over time, changes in linguistic use also reflected social transformations. Some languages gained predominance in religious contexts, others spread for economic reasons, and some were relegated to domestic or rural spheres. This dynamic was influenced by factors such as access to urban centers, contact with other cultures, or policies imposed from the outside. However, the core of the Maya linguistic tradition was maintained, adapting to new circumstances without losing its essence. This capacity for adaptation allowed the languages to remain alive, even under adverse conditions, transmitting values, knowledge, and collective memories that dated back to the times before European contact. The hierarchical order in the centuries of splendor. Throughout their development, the Mayan peoples established hierarchical systems where the ruling group was composed of individuals considered of noble lineage. This nobility not only had hereditary privileges, but also exercised direct authority over the lands and population under their domain. Their influence extended to both civil matters and religious duties, being responsible for organizing political work and the rites linked to traditional worship. Within this framework, administrative positions were distributed primarily among people belonging to this elevated group, which ensured their predominance and continuity in power. The highest rank within this structure was occupied by the supreme ruler of each territorial unit, known by titles that varied from one region to another, but whose main function was to direct the affairs of both the state and the temple. This chief was not only the maximum political figure, but also the head of the ceremonial hierarchy. His position, acquired by inheritance, granted prestige and allowed him to exert control over the resources and relevant decisions of his community. Operating around him were different officials who performed specialized tasks. Among these positions was the administrator, who supervised tributes and the redistribution of goods received by the central power. This official had to keep exact accounts of the flow of products and ensure that contributions arrived from the different subjugated communities. On some occasions, this role was performed by people instructed in the handling of codices and calculations, which indicated the existence of certain technical training linked to the state apparatus. Another important post was that of the one who led the warriors, whose responsibility was to coordinate the defense of the territory and participation in campaigns of expansion or punishment. In addition to military and economic aspects, there were figures responsible for recording relevant events, such as births, deaths, and changes in leadership. These scribes or chroniclers managed visual documents and numerical symbols that allowed the preservation of institutional memory. The interpreters of the sacred signs were also present, acting as intermediaries between the human world and supernatural forces. Their prognostics and advice influenced the decisions of the supreme leader, especially in relation to the cycles of time and the choice of dates to celebrate rituals or undertake public actions. The Mayan territories did not form a single political unit, but were divided into multiple autonomous entities, each with its own system of government and networks of influence. These units often competed with each other for control of trade routes, agricultural zones, and ceremonial centers. In some regions, alliances were formed between different entities, while in others, constant wars for territorial dominance prevailed. Despite these differences, the organizational elements were similar and responded to common patterns of structure and hierarchy. Each of these units could be considered an independent kingdom, with defined borders and a well-established ruling class. Within them, there were internal divisions based on economic, military, and religious functions. The subordinate villages answered to the governing center, which was often a main city from which authority was exercised. The link between the different social levels was maintained through obligations of service, tribute, and loyalty, reinforced by cultural mechanisms that legitimized the position of the rulers. The transfer of power was usually carried out within the same dominant families, who justified their right to rule through ancestral narratives that connected them with sacred beings or foundational episodes. These genealogies were preserved in pictographic manuscripts and recited on solemn occasions, which helped consolidate the legitimacy of the ruling dynasties. In some cases, the heirs were prepared from a young age to assume administrative functions through training within the courtly circle or assignment of minor responsibilities that served as training. The most powerful lineages maintained marital ties among themselves as a way to strengthen political alliances. These unions also ensured the transmission of lands, titles, and privileges across generations. Noble women played a relevant role in this process, since through their union with other chiefs they contributed to the integration of territories or the cessation of hostilities. Although they did not always hold formal positions within the governmental apparatus, their influence was evident in the processes of succession and in the internal dynamics of the palaces. Within the royal courts, there were differentiated spaces for the various types of activity. There were areas where government affairs were attended to, places dedicated to the preparation of ceremonial events, and zones reserved for the lodging of officials, servants, and guardians. All of this was under the direction of the ruling house, which decided on the daily life of the subordinate population and on the destinies of its own power structure. The maintenance of these spaces required constant administration and a clear chain of command that would guarantee the execution of orders and the resolution of conflicts. At a local level, each settlement was headed by a representative appointed by the central authority or arising from among the influential families of the place. This delegate had to ensure compliance with the provisions emanating from the regional capital, organize the delivery of products required for tributes, and coordinate the participation of inhabitants in common tasks. They were also entrusted with the maintenance of internal order and the management of disputes between neighbors, which gave them a certain margin of autonomy within their jurisdiction. There was a noticeable difference between those who performed functions on behalf of the central power and those who simply formed part of the bulk of the population. The former enjoyed certain privileges, such as access to special foods, distinctive clothing, or residence in better conditioned areas. These elements contributed to reinforcing their authority and distinguishing them from the rest. However, their position depended largely on the support they received from the upper levels and their ability to fulfill the expectations placed upon them. In some areas, local officials also acted as those in charge of minor religious affairs, guiding offerings and small ceremonies. This duality of functions gave them a central role in the articulation of the community, as they were links between the everyday and the ceremonial. Their permanence in the position was conditioned by their fidelity, their efficiency, and the perception that both their superiors and the members of the populace had of them. In cases of failures or internal conflicts, they could be removed and replaced by others who were more trustworthy or had better family ties. Contact between the different political units was carried out through official envoys who carried messages, gifts, or specific demands. These emissaries were trustworthy people who represented their lords before other courts and knew how to navigate unfamiliar environments. Their task was delicate, as a bad interpretation or an inappropriate gesture could generate unnecessary tensions. At the moments when agreements or pacts were celebrated, these delegates participated in the ceremonies as witnesses and bearers of the agreed terms. Although the borders between the political entities were clear in many cases, conflicts over territories or routes were not uncommon. Competition for fertile zones, water sources, or strategic passes resulted in periodic confrontations. Military campaigns were organized by the rulers with the support of their counselors, who decided when and how to act. The success or failure of these incursions had important consequences for the leader's prestige and for the stability of the government. On occasions, conquests allowed for the expansion of the tributary base or the displacement of uncomfortable rivals. The Mayan political order functioned through a combination of centralized control and decentralized management. Each level of authority answered to a superior one, but maintained a certain autonomy in the administration of daily affairs. This hierarchical structure ensured the continuity of power, but also allowed for adaptation to changes and local particularities. Important decisions required consensus among the main actors, which implied internal negotiations and a balance between divergent interests. Children of the sun and the milpa, the common Mayans and their shared existence. The common inhabitants of the Mayan cities usually lived in simple huts grouped around the ceremonial centers. These dwellings, built with materials available in the region, were rectangular or oval-shaped structures, with sloping roofs covered with palm leaves or thatch. Their walls, raised with reeds or vertical timbers interlaced with vines, were then covered with mud. The majority had a single room without internal divisions and possessed a single access. It was not usual for them to have windows. The floor, directly on the earth, was smoothed and sometimes hardened with lime. Inside, the most notable feature was a stone or clay platform where vessels and other objects of daily use were placed. Along the walls, rolled mats and hanging utensils could be seen. The furniture was limited to some low benches and cotton hammocks that were hung for sleeping. In some homes there was also a hearth formed by 3 large stones where food was cooked. People's attire varied according to the climate and the occasion. In normal times, men dressed in a simple garment tied at the waist that hung down in front and behind, while women wore a huipil that covered them up to the knees. Both garments were made of cotton woven at home. For special days, both men and women wore more elaborate clothes, embroidered and decorated with vegetable dyes. The colors were usually bright. They completed their look with shell, bone, feather, or polished stone ornaments. On their heads, some wore scarves or bands. Women tied their hair back in braids or high buns. The body was subject to aesthetic care. Some filed their teeth to give them a pointed shape, and others inlaid them with jade or pyrite. It was common to paint the face or body with reddish or blackish pigments. Tattoos also formed part of the daily appearance, applied with needles and impregnated with coloring substances. Boys and girls received care from a young age. It was customary to bandage their heads with splints to give them a flattened shape that was considered ideal. They often walked around naked during their first years. As they grew up, they were taught household or field tasks, depending on the sex. Girls helped their mothers with cooking or weaving, while boys accompanied the elders to the milpa. The people's diet was simple and based on corn. This cereal was cooked with lime, then ground on flat stones and kneaded to form tortillas or tamales. Apart from corn, beans, squash, yucca, and chili peppers were also consumed. In some regions, the diet included fish, wild birds, turtles, or iguanas. Stingless bee honey served as a sweetener. In certain festivities, fermented drinks such as balche, made with tree bark soaked in water with honey, were prepared. Cacao was highly valued, although it was not drunk daily. In areas where it did not grow, it was imported through bartering. For cooking, they used clay pots and wooden spoons. Food was prepared over direct fire or steamed, using banana leaves as wrapping. In some places, underground ovens were used to cook meals on special occasions. Backstrap looms ground corn or cooked. They were also responsible for cleaning the dwelling and caring for the children. The days began at sunrise and followed a rhythm marked by food preparation, weaving, and the chores typical of the home. Men, on the other hand, worked in the fields. Each family had a plot that they cleared and planted with corn, squash, and other useful plants. They used rudimentary tools such as sharp sticks, stone axes, and obsidian knives. This task was repeated every year, and when the land was exhausted, another nearby area was sought. In addition to cultivation, men also hunted wild animals. They used traps, nets, and arrows. In the rivers and lagoons, they fished using hooks made with thorns, spears, or woven nets. The products of hunting and fishing supplemented the diet, although their availability depended on the season of the year. Another important task was the gathering of wild fruits, roots, and honey. Women and children usually collaborated in this activity. In their free time, people entertained themselves with games and dances. One of the favorite pastimes was the ball game, although they did not always participate directly. They often limited themselves to observing the matches in the enabled courtyards. Races, wrestling, or strength challenges were also organized. Children played with clay figurines, tops, whistles, or miniature bows. At night, they gathered around the fire to converse or listen to stories. Stories were passed down from generation to generation through the spoken word. The elders played an important role as transmitters of the collective memory. Personal hygiene was a daily custom. People bathed in rivers, ponds, or water holes and used vegetable soaps. They also cleaned themselves with ashes or mud. Some carried with them small gourds with water or instruments for scratching themselves. The heat of the climate and the field activities made bathing a constant necessity. They carefully took care of their hair, nails, and skin. Falling ill was a cause for concern. Ailments were treated with plants, hot baths, or massages. Some diseases were attributed to imbalances or invisible causes, and in those cases, the help of people with special knowledge was sought. Roots, leaves, and resins were used in the form of infusions, ointments, or vapors. Knowledge about health was transmitted orally. Each family had its own practices. Recovery depended on both the treatment and the environment. During prolonged droughts or plagues, the people suffered. Access to water became difficult. In many regions, they depended on cenotes, waterholes, or cisterns carved into the rock. In the rainy season, water was collected in large containers. When the rains did not arrive, the harvests were lost, and the scarcity hit hard. Survival required sharing resources, temporarily migrating or modifying daily activities. Even so, the pace of life continued its course. The family organization revolved around collective work. Parents, children, and grandparents shared the same dwelling and distributed tasks. Marriages were performed at an early age. Young people were united with the consent of their parents. Cohabitation began with simple agreements, and each one contributed to the household economy. Unions were strengthened through the exchange of goods or mutual aid. Sometimes, several generations lived together under the same roof. The utensils used in daily life were made in the home or obtained through bartering. Each family manufactured what was necessary with the materials available in their environment, adapting them to the tasks of the field and the home. Women made the clothing, spun the cotton, and wove, while men raised the dwellings, cleared plots, and opened roads. Daily life required skill, collaboration, and constant effort. In the markets, people exchanged products from the field for goods they could not manufacture. Cacao, salt, cotton, fabrics, honey, utensils, and prepared foods circulated among the people's hands. Each city had its market day. It was a time for gathering, chatting, and movement. Objects from other places were seen there, prices were discussed, and deals were made. Money, as it is known today, was not used, but certain products functioned as a medium of exchange. Women actively participated in commerce. The people's calendar was linked to the agricultural seasons. They knew when to plant, when to expect rain, and when to harvest. Observations of the sky helped to foresee the changes of season. Although the activities of the common people were not recorded in monuments, their routine sustained the general functioning of the cities. Every action had a meaning within the whole. Daily existence was practical, constant, and marked by collective work. The life of the people was not recorded in codices or sculptures, but it was the silent base upon which the entire civilization was sustained. the sacred and the bloody, gods, rites, and cosmovision. Over centuries, the Mayan religion slowly changed from a simple cult related to nature to a complex system directed by priests. Initially, when they were still nomads, their beliefs revolved around natural forces that did not require complex rituals or temples. Each family head acted as a spiritual guide within their hut, something that could still be seen among the Lacandan Maya of Chiapas. But when they adopted agriculture and began to live in permanent settlements, new forms of religious organization appeared. Priests were created, more elaborate ceremonial centers were built, and a more sophisticated ritual system was developed. Between the centuries before and after the beginning of the Christian era, new gods, stone temples, and a more elaborate theology emerged. The priests began to organize the cult based on the observation of time and the stars, which shaped a more precise ritual system. At the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ, these changes became evident in Uaxactun, with carved sculptures, Tikal ceramics, and the use of vaulted roofs. This transformation coincided with a notable cultural development in the north and center of Peten, although it is not clear whether it was due to external influences or internal evolution. Towards the 4th century after Christ, a sophisticated religion already existed that combined natural elements with celestial observations, served by a disciplined priestly body composed of mathematicians, astronomers, and ritual experts. During the Classic period, the sculptures suggest a solemn religion with scarce representations of human sacrifices. This period was considered the most spiritually elevated. But later, in the Puyuk and Mexican era, drastic changes were introduced. Many chroniclers of the 16th century indicated that the Mexicans brought with them idolatry and massive sacrifices. Accounts affirm that before the arrival of Kukulkan, also called Quetzalcoatl, in Yucatán, that practice did not exist. It was said that he taught the use of stone, clay, or wood idols, and the offering of blood, hearts, and other offerings. Herrera, an official chronicler, confirmed that human sacrifice arrived from Mexico. The archaeological evidence from Chichen Itza reinforces this version. Several representations in frescoes, codices, and gold discs evidence its massive practice in the Mexican period. Other images in codices such as the Dresden and the Trocortesian also belong to the post-Classic era, while the only 2 images from the Classic were found in Piedras Negras. Centuries later, the imposition of Christianity profoundly altered the ancient Maya religion. The traditional faith did not disappear completely, but what survived was the popular worship of natural deities such as the chassis, gods of rain. The more complex gods disappeared along with the priests who served them. The impact of the conquest was felt most harshly in the priestly caste. The Christian God did not allow competition, and those who did not abandon the old beliefs were eliminated. However, the Maya continued to merge Christian elements with ancient cults. In Yucatán, the archangel Michael was identified with the chassis, and in Belize, the saints transformed into patrons of corn and rain. For the Maya, the creator of the world was Hunabku, father of Itzamna. Although Hunabku represented the idea of a single god, he had no prominence in daily life. Instead, the Popol Vuh mentions that corn was the basis of human creation. They believed in cosmic cycles. Several worlds had existed before the current one, all destroyed by floods. Landa mentions the Bakab, 4 brothers in charge of supporting the sky after creation. The last page of the Dresden Codex shows this ending. A celestial serpent spits water onto the earth, accompanied by a goddess with an inverted pitcher, the god of war, and signs of eclipses. In the modern tradition of northern Yucatán, there is talk of 3 previous worlds. The first was inhabited by dwarves who built cities in the darkness and were petrified when the sun came out. The second was inhabited by transgressors and also ended in a flood. The third, populated by the Maya themselves, was destroyed by another great flood. The current world, a mixture of the previous ones, will also be destroyed by water. The worldview was dual. The good gods brought rain, corn, and abundance, while the bad ones caused droughts, hurricanes, and conflicts. In the codices, Chaak, the god of rain, is shown protecting a tree that Apuk, god of death, tries to destroy. They conceive the universe as 13 superimposed heavens, each with its god, called Oxlahuntiku, and 9 lower levels with deities called Bolontiku. The deepest was Mitnal, ruled by Apuk. The main purpose of the religion was to achieve health, food, and well-being. The Maya offered prayers and sacrifices to achieve this. Ceremonies began with fasting and sexual abstinence, especially for the priests. They also avoided meat, salt, and chili during that time. Sacrifices varied according to urgency. Minor illnesses were treated with simple offerings, while serious crises required human blood. A common practice was self-sacrifice. They bled parts of the body, ears, cheeks, tongue, or even the penis. This blood was used to anoint idols. Women did not bleed themselves but offered animal blood. The use of incense was also common in all ceremonies. Copal, the resin of the tree of the same name, was the most valuable. It was pressed into decorated tablets and burned in vessels shaped like deities. If no animals were available, they modeled hearts in copal. In one of these, a vegetable replica of a human heart was found. Some communities, such as the Lacandones, still burn copal in ancient temples such as those in Yaxchilan or Tulum. Another ritual form was dance. Many variants existed, always associated with specific ceremonies. Men and women usually danced separately. In a war dance called Holkan Okot, hundreds of men danced with flags to the rhythm of war. In another dance called Kolomsha, one participant threw staffs that another skillfully caught using a short stick. Festivals attracted thousands of people from distant places. The Maya believed that the soul was immortal and that there was life after death. According to Landa, some went to a paradise full of food and shade under the sacred yakcha tree, while others descended to Mitnal, where hunger, cold, and pain were constant. Suicides were received by Ixtab, goddess of the rope, who led them to paradise. Fallen warriors, women who died in childbirth, and priests also reached that destination. Neither heaven nor hell had an end, because the soul could not die. The language of the stone, writing, numbers, and astronomy. Although very ancient remains with signs similar to Mayan characters have been found in various areas of the region, Mayan writing appears fully developed on the stelae and monuments of the Classic period. On these stone blocks, the carved signs follow a complex and organized pattern that mixes phonetic elements with ideograms. The glyphs, as these signs are known, were used systematically to record names, dates, and historical events. The spatial distribution of the signs within the texts followed specific rules, in double columns that were read from left to right and from top to bottom, which indicates an established convention. Each glyph could represent a sound, a complete word, or an idea. Some signs were purely phonetic, while others functioned as logograms. This allowed multiple combinations and ways of writing the same names or phrases. Mayan scribes used this system in inscriptions on stone, ceramics, shells, or codices of amate paper covered with lime. Although most of these codices were destroyed, some survived and show the continuous use of the writing system. The system included more than 800 distinct signs, although not all were used at the same time or in all regions. Some local variants shared common signs, but developed particular graphic styles. Knowledge of writing was concentrated in a specialized elite, possibly related to the priestly caste. The inscriptions reveal a preoccupation with recording genealogies, successions of rulers, and military deeds. The scenes represented were often accompanied by texts that offered precise details, such as exact dates and names of people or places. The calendar was a fundamental tool in the organization of time and ceremonial life. The Mayans employed several systems simultaneously. One of them was the ritual calendar of 260 days, formed by the combination of 20 diurnal signs with 13 numbers. Each day had a unique name in a cycle that was constantly repeated. This calendar had a divinatory and ritual function and governed many activities related to religion and omens. At the same time, the solar calendar of 365 days was used, divided into 18 months of 20 days and an additional period of 5 days considered unfavorable. These days did not have specific names and were treated with caution. Both calendars were combined in a larger cycle of 52 years, known as the calendar round. At the end of each cycle, special ceremonies were held to ensure the continuity of time and prevent catastrophes. In addition to these two systems, the Mayans used the long count to date historical events. This system started from a mythical base date and successively added days using increasing units called kin, uinal, tun, katun, and baktun. Inscriptions with long count dates allow chronological placement of events with great precision. Many stelae show these dates at the beginning of the text, followed by descriptions of the events that occurred. The mastery of the calendar required advanced mathematical knowledge. The Mayans used a vigesimal system with specific signs for numbers. A dot represented the unit, a bar was worth 5, and a special symbol indicated 0. This notation allowed them to represent large quantities with relative ease. Thanks to this system, they could calculate astronomical cycles with notable accuracy. The observation of the sky occupied a central place in intellectual life. Mayan astronomers followed the movements of the sun, the moon, Venus, and other celestial bodies. The data collected served to predict eclipses, determine agricultural dates, and establish festivities. Venus had a prominent role, and its synodic cycle was measured with great precision. Some codices contain tables that record these movements and relate them to omens or ritual events. Buildings dedicated to astronomical observation were constructed with specific orientations. Some structures are aligned with the solstices or the equinoxes. The openings and corridors of certain temples allowed observation of sunrises and sunsets on designated dates. These alignments were not casual but part of a systematic knowledge. Cities were planned considering these factors, which demonstrates an integration between astronomy, architecture, and ritual. Astronomical knowledge was not separate from the religious system. Celestial phenomena were interpreted as divine signals. The appearance or disappearance of certain stars marked favorable or dangerous moments. The astronomical tables in the codices show detailed calculations and repetitive schemes that allowed for the anticipation of different events. The work of the astronomers required constant observation and precise management of the calendar. The figures used to record astronomical dates could reach several thousands. Despite the complexity, the scribes managed to capture the information clearly. The codices reveal the use of graphical schemes to show intervals between phenomena. Numerical series were also used to project future positions of Venus or the Moon. The combination of text, number, and drawing made the information accessible to the initiated. Among the preserved codices, some stand out for their astronomical content. These works show predictions of eclipses, lunar phases, and planetary movements. Each section is accompanied by illustrations and brief notes. In several cases, the days of the ritual calendar are associated with specific meanings, which allowed for the assignment of symbolic value to celestial events. The predictions were not only technical, but also part of an interpretive tradition. The use of 0 in the numerical system was a significant achievement. This sign facilitated calculations and the representation of remote dates. The use of 0 in calendrical contexts shows an advanced understanding of cyclic time. The presence of this concept in ancient inscriptions demonstrates that its invention was neither late nor isolated. 0 had a distinctive shape and appeared in key positions in the dates. The calendar not only organized daily life but also served as a framework for history and religion. Every event was dated with precision and inserted into a broader cycle. This cyclical perspective of time influenced the interpretation of the past and the planning of the future. Rulers consulted experts before making important decisions. Military campaigns, ceremonies, and changes of power were synchronized with the calendar. The writing system, mathematics, and astronomy were deeply interrelated. The three areas complemented each other and served as instruments of power and legitimation. The ability to read the signs, calculate the cycles, and foresee the stars was reserved for specialists trained for years. Records show that this knowledge was rigorously transmitted and kept secret within certain groups. Although many codices and monuments were destroyed, what has survived allows for the detailed reconstruction of a good part of Mayan knowledge. The preserved stelae, inscriptions, and texts show a rich and structured intellectual tradition. The written legacy left visible traces in the archaeological remains. Through them, it is possible to know how they counted time, recorded their histories, and observed the firmament. From the pyramid to the sakbe. The Mayan architectural legacy began to take shape in the highlands of Guatemala, where the first ceremonial constructions emerged. During the Preclassic period, platforms made of earth were erected, with simple structures on top. Later, already in the Classic period, those platforms evolved into stone-covered pyramids with stairs leading to the summit. These stairways were placed at the front, and the upper structure was usually a kind of sanctuary, elevated above the rest of the complex. As time progressed, builders began to locate these platforms in open plazas, where several buildings were organized around them. Thus, the architectural arrangement of the ceremonial centers became more complex. The constructions were not isolated, but formed an articulated set of elements. In places like Uaxactun, for example, you can observe an alignment of 3 small temples arranged in a line with a long platform in front. This pattern seems to have been used for calendrical observations, although here only its shape and spatial distribution are of interest. The architecture of Mayan cities presents an enormous variety, depending on the region and the historical moment. In the northern lowlands, in places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, the constructions show smooth walls on the lower part and decorated areas on the top. In contrast, in Tikal or Copán, very tall structures predominate, with steep steps and elevated roof combs above the temples. These roof combs were decorative structures that protruded above the roof and contributed to the impression of verticality. The materials used varied depending on the area. In the north of Yucatán, where mountains were scarce, limestone was the most used. This rock, easy to work with and abundant in that region, allowed solid walls with smooth finishes to be erected. In the south, where there was more geological diversity, other local stones were also used. Furthermore, in many cases, the buildings were covered with a mixture made of lime and sand, which gave them a white finish. The most utilized construction system by the Mayans was the corbel vault. Instead of building roofs with true arches, they placed blocks that gradually protruded towards the center until closing the space at the top. This technique did not allow for covering large areas, but it was sufficient for their needs. The temples and internal chambers of the palaces were usually roofed in this way. The wider spaces, such as plazas or courtyards, were left open air. Plazas were central elements in urban organization. Generally, the main temples, palaces, and other important structures were arranged around them. Some cities came to have several plazas, connected to each other by raised roads known as sakbeob. These roads, built with stones and covered with stucco, served to connect different areas of the city, or even distant urban centers. One of the longest has been found between Coba and Yaxuna, with several kilometers in length. In the great ceremonial centers, the buildings were grouped following a precise pattern. Important structures were erected on artificial platforms, creating distinct levels within the complex. Temples usually occupied the highest point, while palaces, more elongated in shape and with several entrances, were distributed around the plazas. These constructions were not fortifications, nor were they conceived as defensive dwellings. They were spaces of power, residence, and political activity. Some cities like Tikal show a complex architectural evolution with the superposition of previous structures. That is, when a building became old or they wanted to expand it, instead of demolishing it, it was covered with a new layer of construction. Thus, the same pyramid could contain several previous phases within its volume. This technique allowed the original sacred place to be preserved, while its external appearance was renewed. In Copán, for example, a temple has been documented that was rebuilt at least 10 times, maintaining the same location. This type of architectural accumulation reveals a strong connection between the buildings and the legitimacy of those who commissioned their construction. The act of erecting a new temple over a previous one implied reaffirming dynastic continuity and the permanence of local power. The stairways, often decorated with inscriptions or sculptures, served both a practical and symbolic function. They connected different levels within the architectural complex and reinforced the spatial hierarchy characteristic of Mayan cities. In Chichen Itza, constructive forms uncommon in other Mayan sites appear, such as round columns, flat-roofed galleries, and large open esplanades. This suggests external influences, although here only the architectural result is of interest. One of the best-known buildings in this place is the Pyramid of Kukulkan, with a square base with stairways on each side and a temple at the top. On specific dates of the year, sunlight projects shadows that appear to form a serpent descending the stairway. Another frequent feature at various sites is the presence of ball courts, spaces delimited by high walls that stand out within the urban plan due to their proportions and location. In places like Yaxchilan, for example, the architecture takes advantage of the orography, with buildings that adapt to the slope of the terrain. In Bonampak, the structures are grouped on terraces that overlook the valley. In each case, a planned, though not symmetrical use of space is observed, reflecting a planned conception. The roofs of the constructions were made with corbel vaults, sometimes covered by an upper slab. In smaller buildings, the roof could be formed by wooden beams and plant coverings, but in the temples and palaces, stone solutions predominated. The walls were covered with a mixture of lime, and some surfaces were smoothed with stucco, leaving smooth surfaces that could then be painted or engraved. Evolution of material, art, technique, and meaning throughout the centuries. Mayan sculptures were modeled with visible care in every detail. The most common was to work directly on limestone, although other hard rocks were also carved when the material allowed it. The stelae were mainly used to depict human figures or hierarchies, while the altars served as the base for public acts. Often both pieces were part of the same complex, with the stela standing behind the altar. Sculptors managed to represent postures, ornaments, and gestures with great precision, despite the hardness of the material. In certain regions, like Copán, a higher technical level was noticeable, with figures in deep relief and meticulous details. Some pieces included glyphs around the edge, marking dates or identifying characters. In other areas, such as Quirigua, the monumentality of the sculptures stood out, often superior in size to those of other cities. There were also rounded monuments with complex shapes or faces sculpted on all their sides. Over the centuries, sculptural styles evolved, always maintaining a direct relationship with the function they had within the city. Fired clay objects occupied a central place in Mayan material life. All types of vessels were molded, from the simplest for cooking to those decorated with complex shapes and reliefs. Some were smooth and utilitarian, intended for daily use, while others featured human faces, animal legs, or figures carefully painted. The most used colors were red, black, and cream, applied with a brush to the surface before firing. In many cases, the containers were used to store food or liquids, and they adapted to the needs of each family group. Figurines, whistles, ornaments, and lids with symbolic shapes were also manufactured. The kiln was lit with firewood and reached sufficient temperatures to harden the pieces without vitrifying them. The clay was carefully selected, mixed with sand or ash to improve its resistance. Each village had its particular ceramic style, and the fragments found today allow for the identification of regions or periods. Regarding textiles, they were mainly made from cotton fibers cultivated by the Mayans themselves. Women spun the material in their homes, using spindles made of fired clay or wood. Then they dyed it with natural substances extracted from plants, seeds, or bark. With the backstrap loom, which was attached to a post and to the weaver's body, they produced resistant fabrics, decorated with color bands or geometric motifs. Daily clothing was usually simple, but on certain occasions, more complex garments were made, embroidered or adorned with feathers. Loincloths, blankets, tunics, or headdresses were adapted to the climate and the social function of the wearer. The dyeing technique allowed for varied combinations, and some dyes were highly valued for their rarity or intensity. Despite the humid climate, well-preserved textiles found in tombs or caves confirm the widespread use of these techniques. In parallel, basketry was worked with flexible branches, vines, and braided leaves. The women collected the material around the village and moistened it to facilitate its handling. Baskets were woven in a spiral or with crossed frameworks according to the intended use. Some were used to transport ears of corn or fruits, others to store grains or utensils. Mats for sleeping, fans, hats, and bags with fine fibers were also manufactured. Although most were domestic products, there were more elaborate objects used in important events. The techniques varied between communities, but shared the same logic of utilizing natural resources. Sun-drying and care against humidity prolonged the useful life of each piece. Jade was one of the most coveted materials, almost always reserved for prominent figures. The green stones were imported from specific regions, where they were extracted from deep veins with rudimentary tools. The carving required skill, as the mineral was extremely hard. Ropes with sand were used as an abrasive, and the work could take days or weeks. The result was beads, pendants, masks, or inlays that accompanied burials or ceremonies. Some pieces had the shape of animals, others showed faces with almond-shaped eyes and open mouths. They were also decorated with fine lines engraved on the surface. In certain cases, jade was combined with shells or softer stones to create contrasts. The color varied between light and dark green, depending on the origin of the stone. Due to their rarity, these objects were signs of status and rarely reached the hands of the common people. Stone was also used to manufacture basic tools and utensils. Resistant rocks like flint or obsidian were chosen, and they were shaped by controlled blows. With them, blades, scrapers, points for spears or arrows were made, and also instruments for working wood. Axes were polished until straight edges were obtained, capable of cutting trees or shaping logs. The cores were reused to produce new edges when the previous ones wore out. Obsidian, brought from distant regions, allowed for fine and precise cuts, useful in delicate tasks. The hardest stones were reserved for heavy tasks, such as excavating or opening roads. Small fragments were also used to engrave details on other materials. Each object responded to a clear function, and its design reflected the practical need of the user. Metals were scarce, but they were worked with careful techniques. Gold and copper, obtained in external regions, were melted in simple molds to produce rings, discs, or hair ornaments. Fine sheets were also hammered to cover surfaces or form figures. Although they were not used for utilitarian purposes, metallic objects had a symbolic value and were linked to certain social functions. Bronze appeared in some southern regions, especially in late dates. The Mayans did not develop iron tools, and their metallic technology remained limited. However, the pieces found show an advanced knowledge of modeling and polishing. Obtaining the metal required exchange with other cultures, which gave it an additional value. Thus, the material base of a civilization that never stopped transforming was built century after century. For centuries, the Mayans built cities, recorded time, organized their territories, and maintained an order that changed with the passing of generations. Nothing of what they built was eternal, but much managed to endure. The temples, the codices, and the stones were left behind. However, the living languages, customs, and ways of life continued. Faced with invasions, external pressures, and internal transformations, the Mayan legacy maintained its course. This civilization was not defined by a single moment, but by its capacity to maintain itself over time.